Greetings. This is video assignment 2 for Mr. Eads' History 1302 class at North Central Texas College, titled African Americans and Jim Crow. NCTC students, if you have not downloaded the review sheets that go with this video assignment, please go back to Canvas now and download those review sheets before continuing any further. For everyone else, just enjoy this video. This video is on African Americans and Jim Crow. And where I would like to begin is the discussion of Jim Crow segregation. The Supreme Court also endorsed racial segregation after Reconstruction, after their decision in the Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Plessy v. Ferguson is significant because it opened the door to segregation, and it legalized the term separate but equal, the concept of separate facilities as long as they were equal. And what a difference a generation makes. Most Northerners in 1896 supported this decision by the Supreme Court, whereas their fathers went to war. Now with the law on their side, Southern Democratic governments, the Bourbons, then passed laws that required separate accommodations for blacks in schools, prisons, hospitals, recreational facilities, and my personal sarcastic favorite, cemeteries. These laws became known collectively as the Jim Crow laws. Now, the term Jim Crow comes from a character in old minstrel shows and was featured in a 19th century tune called Jump Jim Crow, as it was performed normally by someone using blackface. One irony of state-enforced segregation, racial segregation, is that it opened up economic opportunities for blacks. A new class of African American entrepreneurs emerged to provide services for the African American community: insurance companies, banks, funeral parlors, barbers, as the African American community needed these services. At the same time, African Americans formed their own social and fraternal clubs and organizations, of which bolstered black pride and provided fellowship and opportunities for service. But the main thrust of the Jim Crow laws was at voting and enfranchisement. Southern Democrats went out of their way to keep African American men out of the ballot box. First, they used a process called bulldozing. It remained common practice during this period of the New South. Bulldozing describes the intimidation of blacks, African American men, to either vote for Democrats or to not vote at all. Those who attempted to vote Republican were visited at night and literally whipped into line in front of their families. Fact is, in the late 19th century, private voting machines as we know them did not exist. There was only a box manned by an election official who could see how one voted, because all the ballots were done in paper. For that matter, because most people did not know how to read, the tickets were colored. Thus, it was easy to intimidate a voter into voting the right way, so to speak. The Bourbon Democrats also employed other methods to eliminate the African American vote. First, they used a residency requirement that stated that a voter must live in the same place for 2 years. Now, this was aimed at sharecroppers and tenant farmers who had a tendency of moving from year to year in search of better land and a better working relationship. Then, Bourbon Democrats implemented the poll tax. Now, a poll tax is nothing more than a fee that must be paid well in advance in order to vote. The poll tax kept many poor whites from voting. After all, when a farmer is living off of credit, thanks to the crop lien system, paying to vote becomes a luxury, even if the fee is only $2 a year. Texas instituted the poll tax in 1902. Third method, Bourbon Democrats decided that voters need to be able to read. Thus, they instituted a literacy test. And the literacy test had the potential voter to read a section of the Constitution to an election official. African Americans who attempted to take this test were uniformly declared to have failed it. However, there's a problem here. If your goal is to take African American men out of the ballot box, literacy test also takes poor whites out as well, as many are illiterate. Thus, Bourbon Democrats implement 2 changes to the literacy test. First change is the understanding clause. This is nothing more than a loophole. It gave illiterate whites a chance to beat the test. Understanding clause said, if the voter could explain a section of the Constitution that was read to them, they passed the test. Thus, under the understanding clause, the white voter received something like the Second Amendment. Meanwhile, African American voter received a section on taxation. The second way out of the literacy test was the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause simply granted voter eligibility to those voters whose fathers and grandfathers have been eligible to vote. Now, this grandfather clause is clearly aimed at eliminating African Americans from the ballot box because African Americans' fathers and grandfathers were not able to vote, as most were slaves. Thus, these methods shut African Americans out of the ballot box. Blacks take different approaches on how to retaliate to this because they have the right to vote. It's guaranteed to them by the 15th Amendment. Some African Americans wanted to fix it through racial pride. Other African Americans became so disenchanted with this new South that they tried to revive the African colonization movement. But these 2 ideas, militancy and black separatism, won few supporters among this generation of Southern African Americans, because these Southern African Americans considered themselves Americans and considered their home the South. Most African Americans instead leaned toward the tactics of activism or to the tactics of accommodation. Thus, we'll begin a discussion of 3 activists who take on one of these topics. And for students, you'll be required to know which activist goes with which theory, activism or accommodation. Our first is Ida B. Wells. She was an outspoken critic of Jim Crow segregation. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in 1862 in Mississippi. Miss Wells attended a school staffed by white missionaries, and she learned how to read. At age 16, Wells took responsibility for her 5 younger siblings after her parents died in the yellow fever epidemic. In 1880, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and started teaching school. In 1883, Ida B. Wells started her activism by being denied a seat on a railroad car. This is a whole 15 years before Plessy. This prompted Ida Wells to sue the railroad, and the circuit court in Tennessee ruled in her favor. Unfortunately, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the circuit court's ruling. The experience introduced Ida B. Wells to journalism, and through it, what she called, quote, the weapon with which to wage a crusade for justice. Soon, Miss Wells became a prominent editor of the Memphis Free Speech. In 1892, when 3 of her friends were lynched by a white mob, Ida Wells launched a lifelong crusade against lynching. She published a pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Angry whites responded by destroying Wells's office and threatened to lynch her. She moves north to New York and continues her crusade. In 1898, she spent 5 weeks in Washington, D.C., trying to persuade the federal government to do something about lynching. In 1909, she helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP, and worked to promote women's suffrage. Ida B. Wells believed in ceaseless activism. But by promoting full equality with her activism, Wells placed herself in direct opposition to the views of another activist, Booker T. Washington. But Booker T. Washington believed in two things: education and accommodation. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia in 1856. He supported himself by working as a janitor by day and studying at night. His life experiences convinced Washington that African Americans must lift themselves up, but at the same time, they must accommodate white prejudice. With the help of Northern philanthropists, Booker T. Washington funds Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1801. The Tuskegee Institute specializes in what was then called industrial education. We know it better today as trade school, career courses, not academic courses. Washington believed that by teaching African Americans trades, this was a way that African Americans could show their worth to whites. In 1895, Washington delivered a speech at the Cotton States International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. Washington told the African Americans in the audience that progress up the social ladder would not come from, quote, artificial forcing, but from self-improvement. To this, the African Americans responded with mixed feelings. That, yes, they knew they had to improve themselves, but they also knew that artificial forcing might be necessary. At the same time, Washington asked the whites in the audience to help African Americans advance. This request won him many friends in the North, and this is essentially what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the Atlanta Compromise. Du Bois disagrees with Washington, and that he says, unlike Washington, Du Bois would not surrender the leadership of his race to cowards. W.E.B. Du Bois wanted a more aggressive strategy than Washington. Du Bois wants ceaseless activism or ceaseless agitation. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts in 1868. His grandmother, Elizabeth Freeman, sued for her freedom from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1781 and won her case. In fact, it's Freeman's case against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that helped lead Massachusetts to outlaw slavery in 1781. Du Bois studied at Fisk University in Tennessee and at the University of Berlin before attending Harvard in the late 1880s and receiving his PhD. Du Bois believed in education. He urged African Americans to aspire to professional careers, to become doctors, lawyers, dentists. He urged them to fight for the restoration of their civil rights and to get a college education. To Du Bois, ceaseless activism was not violence. It was protecting and demanding the rights that had already been given. As Du Bois's tactics of ceaseless activism formed the core of the NAACP, their values in the early 20th century. And also, this is going to be the views taken by the modern civil rights movement in the latter half of the 20th century. Thank you for watching this video on African Americans and Jim Crow, and may the force be with you.